Nationalism, Populism, and the Rise of Andrew Jackson. Welcome to this week's mini lesson. I'm Mr. Rosenleaf. Let's get underway. These three topics are so important, not just to this period of American history, but throughout American history as well. So let's start with that first ism, that nationalism. During the 1820s, you start to get a sense of nationalism in America. Not true nationalism, not people thinking of themselves as Americans. Nationalism, they're still citizens of their state first, certainly. But you start to see a national identity forming in the country. You have the stability of a political leader with no real opposition whatsoever in James Monroe, who was president from 1817 to 1825. Last, incidentally, in our line of Virginians. Washington obviously was a Virginian. Thomas Jefferson was a Virginian. James Madison was a Virginian, and now James Monroe. Of the first 6 presidents, 4 of the 6 were from Virginia, and 2 were from another state, that state being Massachusetts, with John Adams and his son John Quincy. I'm spoiling later on a little bit for you. But this period, 1817 to 1825, during James Monroe's administration, was known as the era of good feelings. There was only one political party, the Democratic Republican Party. The Federalist Party had basically disappeared by this point, except sort of very regionally up in New England, but they were pretty much dead in the water at this point. So the government set about solving sectional issues, or trying to, although they didn't succeed in that, given that slavery and sectionalism will divide the country later on. But they start to adopt nationalist policies, things like building roads and infrastructure, including the kind of famous National Road stretching from Maryland all the way to what is today West Virginia. Big national road there. The Supreme Court started making national decisions that emphasized the nation over the states. So things like McCulloch versus Maryland, where they decided that the state of Maryland was not allowed to tax an entity of the federal government, the second bank of the United States. And Gibbons versus Ogden, where they determined that only Congress can regulate interstate commerce. That was about 2 states issuing competing charters for steamboat businesses between New York and New Jersey. And then finally, the Monroe Doctrine, which said that the Western Hemisphere was basically off limits to European powers, that anything that had not already been claimed by Western powers was out of bounds, and that the United States, if a Western power, if a European power went to take that, the United States would view that very seriously and would view that as an act of war. Now, at the time, did we have the military chutzpah to back that up? No, we did not, certainly. But as we move forward, we certainly will. And we will continue to use the Monroe Doctrine as a basis of U.S. foreign policy to this day, including Teddy Roosevelt, who will make it his own in the early 1900s with the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. We'll talk about that when we get to there. But still, that was a nationalist policy, and so Monroe Doctrine was about nationalism, was about emphasis of the nation. And so again, James Monroe, just right there, a nice picture of the guy. Really our last figure that had anything to do personally with the Revolution. Okay, so 1824 rolls around and Monroe decides he is not going to run for re-election, and now the era of good feelings really ends. You see 4 competing candidates, not parties, vying for the presidency in 1824. This is the presidential election of 1824. And what you'll notice is that no one gets a majority. A majority is 50% plus 1. No one gets a majority either of the popular vote. So, even with Andrew Jackson, 43% of the country voted for him. More of the country voted for somebody else. The electoral vote, only 38%. More of the country voted for somebody else than voted for Jackson. So when The Electoral College, remember the popular vote doesn't mean anything in presidential elections really, when the Electoral College could not reach a majority decision, they have to get 50% plus one on their first vote. They don't get to do subsequent votes, just the first vote. When they couldn't do that, then the election goes to the House of Representatives. And they would be the ones that would decide this election. So in taking a look just very briefly at the candidates, you have John Quincy Adams, who was the current Secretary of State, very well-credentialed man. Had been Secretary of State, had been a member of the Senate, had been an ambassador, had served abroad while his father was serving abroad. He had started out as the secretary to the ambassador, I think, to Russia, and then became an ambassador in his own right. So he's a very well-credentialed man. Andrew Jackson, who had been a general in the War of 1812, was the hero of the Battle of New Orleans, was running basically as a war hero. Crawford, don't worry about Crawford, not all that important. Then Henry Clay. So Henry Clay does not advance to the vote in the House, but Henry Clay was in the House because Henry Clay was Speaker of the House. So Henry Clay certainly had a say as to who was going to be president, had a big say, could swing the election. You might say that Henry Clay got to say who was president. And that, before we get to the rest of that story, brings us to populism. Populism, if you just remember power to the people, we're going to be in good shape. Populism is power to the people, a political approach striving to appeal to ordinary people who feel their concerns are being disregarded or ignored by the establishment or elite groups, by those already in power. So those in power don't represent me. Those in power don't speak for me. The government works for, let's say, wealthy, powerful people, but not for me. I'm just a regular citizen, and I don't feel that the government works for me. Folks that believe that are very susceptible to what's known as populism. They might join a populist movement trying to regain a sense of that power. And that's what you see happen starting in 1824 with the election of 1824. You see the general population really rallying behind one particular candidate, and that candidate was Andrew Jackson. You also start to see that later on in history, and even today you have candidates at both ends of the political spectrum that talk about taking power away from the establishment, that talk about draining the swamp, that talk about being the only person that can fix the problems of their constituency, that their constituency, the people that they represent, have been forgotten by the powerful, and that we need to take back that power. Who does that sound like? You're going to get to tell me later on. So who does that sound like? Who do you think? Give it some thought. Maybe even pause and give it some thought. Think about both sides of the political spectrum, not just the one you might be most familiar with. Okay, so anyway, back to our story. And the general public will go completely bonkers when it is announced that John Quincy Adams has been elected president of the United States, despite the fact that he did not get a plurality, most of the votes, a bulk of the votes in the popular vote, and that he did not get a plurality in the Electoral College. He has been named President of the United States because Henry Clay has whipped the votes to make it so. And the next thing you know, Adams is announcing that his Secretary of State is going to be, drumroll, Henry Clay. Now, remember that Thomas Jefferson had been Washington's Secretary of State. James Madison had been Jefferson's Secretary of State. James Monroe had been Madison's Secretary of State, and now John Quincy Adams had been Monroe's Secretary of State. And so the general public thought, well, if the establishment is allowed to have their way, our next president is going to be Henry Clay. And they didn't necessarily feel that that was right. And so Jackson's supporters called this a corrupt bargain. And at this point, I am going to pause for just a second and allow you to look up a song from the musical Bloody Bloody Andrew Jackson called The Corrupt Bargain, and give that a listen. I would play it now, but I don't want to get content struck on YouTube. So just for a moment, I'm going to pause. Okay, we're coming back now. I hope you enjoyed that song. So in 1828, this is not going to happen again. Between 1824 and 1828, John Quincy Adams will be president. And again, extremely well-credentialed man, extremely qualified to be president. Henry Clay, very qualified to be Secretary of State. No one is saying otherwise. But they were not who the bulk of the population really wanted. And so the supporters of Jackson in Congress will basically make it so that Clay and Adams really don't get much accomplished in their 4 years. And then 4 years after those 4 years in 1828, that ain't going to happen again. Jackson is going to roll to a substantial victory, a super landslide victory is what we would call that today, with 56% of the popular vote and with 68% of the electoral vote. Certainly a super landslide victory in the Electoral College. There was no doubt of who was going to be president this time. It was going to be Andrew Jackson. The general public did rejoice at Andrew Jackson being elected president. But before we get to how much they rejoiced, here's a lovely picture of Andrew Jackson, by the way. I do want to share with you our mini lesson journal topic of the week, number 5. It's a 3-parter. I want to know, what is nationalism, and how did the government of the 1820s emphasize nationalism? I want to know, what is populism, and which political figure was painted as a populist hero in 1824 and 1828? And then finally, what modern political figures try to style themselves as populists? And do you think that this is an effective strategy? Why or why not? So that is your mini lesson journal topic of the week. But before we end this session, I do want to share with you how much the public rejoiced at Jackson being sworn in. The party after his inauguration lasted at least 3 days on the White House lawn. And we're not talking they ate cookies and drank punch. I'm talking they drank moonshine and passed out in the Rose Garden. Jackson opened the White House to the masses. In the main foyer of Andrew Jackson's White House, in fact, was a 2-ton block of cheese. And it was there for any and all that might be hungry. The public could come in, have a piece of cheese, which, by the way, lasted the entirety of Jackson's 2 terms in office, and meet the president and meet the president's advisors. That tradition, not the cheese part, thankfully, but the tradition of opening the White House to the public continued into the presidency of Abraham Lincoln in the 1860s. If you ever watched the movie Lincoln, the one that had Daniel Day-Lewis in it, you will know that the president had to fight his way through throngs of people in the White House trying to get personal things attended to by the president. That was after Jackson had opened up the White House to the average people. After Lincoln's assassination, that will start to die down, and the president will actually have bodyguards and eventually a secret service to protect them so that they don't get killed. I think during the Civil War, it probably would have been just as easy for John Wilkes Booth to walk into the White House and kill Lincoln as it was to kill him in Ford's Theater. Really and truly, when you think about it, anybody could get into the White House, and Wilkes Booth was a very famous name. They would have welcomed him handily into the White House. Anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself, though. That is the end of what we're talking about today. So I hope you enjoyed that mini lesson, and definitely do the journal topic, and we'll see you next week. Thank you. Bye-bye.